So that's interesting. When you talk about the branding aspect of the way we had computers. I can't even remember the brand of computer. I think the world before Apple really blows up in the late '90s, 2000s. Um, it's a different technological world.
Hmm.
Um, there is no real monopoly on things like cell phones because not everybody has them. And computers, there's a lot of people with PCs. I didn't know anyone with a Macintosh. Maybe you did. Maybe you had rich friends. I don't know what side of the tracks you're from. You don't seem like you had Molly Ringwald's Pretty in Pink life. You didn't make your prom dress?
I didn't make my prom dress. No.
Did you had her Breakfast Club life?
Oh no. Oh no. Oh my goodness. Sushi in high school in detention? Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
No. Even when you look at a movie like that, where there which always seemed strange to me, because first of all, that was a massive library.
Massive. You're right. Beautiful.
Right? This is massive. I think they filmed it in a college. They had to.
Must have been.
If that was a public school in Chicago, then we need to have more geniuses coming out of Chicago.
That's a fair point.
Um, um, but there really isn't surveillance. That's why the kids can sneak out. There's no cameras in the school. There's no metal detectors in the school, right? I mean, look, there's so many reasons why. I recently rewatched that movie. I shouldn't say recent, like a year ago on a date. And I was like, oh man, these kids suck.
Oh yeah, you watch Breakfast Club as an adult and you suddenly have a weird sympathy for the janitor and the principal. It's distressing.
Yeah, you really do. You
It's really
really do.
distressing.
You really do. But that school, I'm sure schools like that still exist unless you're going to tell me a horror story that they don't, where there isn't, you don't need cameras and metal detectors and all this tracking software. Or do we just live in a world right now where that's just the norm across the board, whether you go to a nice school with a massive 8-story library or you go to an inner city school where you got 4 books, um, from 1975?
I think that our schools today are surveillance factories, if you will. Like to your point of cameras in the hallways, of
Mhm.
metal detectors when students are walking in. Sure, we're absolutely going to see a difference between um, maybe between urban areas and suburban areas or rural areas, but like maybe not that much, right? And to your point about like wealthier schools versus schools that are more struggling, in fact, one of the things that we found was that a lot of wealthier parents or wealthier school districts are actually looking for more surveillance. In the headlines recently, excuse me, as we're kind of going back to school, we're seeing a lot
Mhm.
of the conversations now about whether schools should ban cell phones in schools or in
I've
classrooms during their
seen
leave
that.
days. Mhm.
I've
I mean,
seen that.
it's not surprising that it's happening right at
I
the end of August, beginning of September. Our brains are on back to school.
Mhm.
And what we're seeing and what we saw from our research was that it's often parents that want their children to have phones and want access to their children during the school day, in part for what they perceive to be a way of kind of keeping their children safer. What the research plays out is that there isn't actually evidence that that our children are safer by having a phone in school. Right. I mean, it's a terrible thing that we have to be having this conversation, right? Again, to you and I and to our age group, we had fire drills, right? And we probably thought they were mostly ridiculous because the way in which you leave a building for a fire drill, we've learned how to be super passive in our exiting of a building during fire drill, right? We've got big signs, we've got staircases. Every one of us in our schools had like the place you went to
Mhm.
with your classroom.
Mhm.
What our young children are dealing with today is active
It's
shooter drills
yeah.
where there is no passive departure, right? There's no passive departure from an active shooter drill. And what we think of as beautiful classrooms or beautiful schools usually make it more dangerous for active shooters because of glass, like lovely windows where
Yeah.
we have natural light. that's pretty
Well,
dangerous.
I'm from Richmond, California, and I don't know if you guys studied that area of California, but the high schools I think there's a couple new ones now, but the high schools in the district have no windows.
Sure, exactly,
They were designed like that in the
they're designed
70s.
like
Yeah.
that, absolutely. Um, and our young children today also went to school during COVID.
Mhm.
And so when parents sent them back to, depending
Mhm.
on where you lived in the United States and whether or not there were lockdowns, if and when parents were sending kids back to school, there was a whole new set of concerns. So, like, we don't want to disrespect parents' fears or parents' concerns. What we actually think is that they're being manipulated. This is, I think, a very cruel thing that these corporations do, which is capitalize on parents' fears about keeping their children safe and selling them this idea that having a camera in a classroom or a metal detector or a technology that monitors their behavior, that monitors what they're doing on their screens, or that having their cell phone in a classroom is going to keep them safer. And as I said, there's not evidence for this. You kind of can't prove a negative, right? I mean, it's like, well, we didn't have a bad thing happen, so therefore the cell phone is the reason why, or the surveillance technology is the reason why. There's no way to
I
really
would point to Parkland and Uvalde as
exactly. I
perfect
mean, we
examples
yep.
of A, you had the training, B, you had an armed guard in Parkland, C, in Uvalde, I think the cops were called and they didn't go, right?
Yeah, and everything was caught on camera and nothing was prevented.
Yeah. So the reality is, it's much like a 9-year-old with a black belt. You can go and pay at a McDojo or
Hmm.
belt factory is what they call them. And you can get a black belt at 9, 10, 11 years old and think you are a badass.
Hmm.
But if you actually get into a fight with someone that's not afraid of contact and probably knows what they're doing, they're going to F you up.
Yep.
You're going to forget all of your horse stance and everything else. And you're gonna feel like the worst person ever. And that you're probably gonna get a gun. You're probably gonna get a weapon of some kind because you found out that you were not the lethal weapon, but just a clown that whose parent paid a lot of money for a black belt, and you have all these trophies for an ass whooping.
Yep.
And that's the way I kind of feel from the standpoint of we have to be able to prevent school shootings because it becomes thought crime at a certain point.
Hmm.
And you kind of talk about that. I mean, there's a movie that came out in the 2000s called Minority Report, with the precogs where they're supposed to, find out the crime before it happens. And that really is the way I think most people view law enforcement, even people in these left spaces. The first thing I always hear people say is, cops don't stop crime. It's like, well, that was really not their job.
Hmm.
A crime is going to happen. Like, you can't, like, you really want someone to, I think you're going to be a bad person and rob someone like that. And to have this kind of explanation for the reason why you're going through young people's emails, because the reality of being a parent is you just don't care about your child's privacy. You don't pay any bills in this house. I love you to death. I might take a bullet for you. I might even take a criminal charge for you. I might, but I'm going to go through your stuff whenever I feel like it. I am the Stasi. Just accept it, right? So when the school says, "Hey, we're going to go through your kid's locker, we're going to have cameras," as a parent, like that, I feel comfortable,
Hmm.
and that's kind of a sad reality of how conservative we are as parents, regardless of how cool we think we are. I know I'm not a cool parent. Look
Well,
at me.
I think there's also like a class-based argument here too, because when we look at things like cell phones or certain types of software that are on students' computers that parents also want access to, we are often looking at a relationship that is really grounded in I access, right? Like, I as the parent, I as the teacher, I'm the one that has access to this. When we look at underserved, underrepresented children growing up in poverty, it is social workers, it is the system, it is the state that has access to it. And excuse me, we have children tracked from toddlerhood. One of the women that we interviewed in our book, she works in early childhood education um, in a school that gets federal funding. And she has to monitor and note the behavior of her students every day. They're 2 years old. Talk to me about what 2-year-old physically behaves, not like not like the Tasman. I mean, children are physical in their bodies, right?
Yes.
But these are children whose parents are probably already in the system, already in some sort of social services or child welfare, whose parents might be receiving unemployment or some sort of state or federal benefits. So they're already tracked. Maybe they live in public housing, so they're already tracked. So now we're just starting it earlier with our toddlers by tracking their behavior as a form of prediction, right? We predict that these young people in particular are going to be bad. I mean, I don't know. I don't really remember a Minority Report being a good or bad movie. I don't. I saw it, but I don't remember the quality of it.
Yeah.
But it's exactly that we think you are going to be bad, and
Yeah.
so therefore we're going to track you. I think when we watched Minority Report, like in the movie theater, like when it first came out, it was probably presented as like, ooh, how futuristic, like how sci-fi and like technologically fascinating. But when we start to break it down, it's we are predetermining who is going to be a criminal. There's a great show on TV. It's called Abbott Elementary. It's
not that great.
Oh,
It's just the Black Office. Just stop.
but I do think it brings up some, some topics in education that largely go untalked about, like in pop culture when we're looking at children's education. And one episode, all the teachers get a tablet that's going to help them teach their students how to read. And it's like, to your point of it being The Office, there's all sorts of sitcom-esque stuff prevails, pratfalls ensue. But at the very end, the principal comes in and, sorry, spoiler alert, the principal comes in and pulls them all back, because apparently the reason why this school got this technology for free was because the Pennsylvania State prison institution was predicting how many beds they would need. And that's
so now I know who wrote that part in the book. But seriously, that when I watched very little of that show, and I'm just giving you a hard time, but you have to be real that everything is The Office post The Office, TV wise. But
no, that's a good. I'm going to think about that. That's a really, I like that.
That's your next book on pop culture.
No, that's my next time on the couch.
You're sitting there stoned, being like, "Oh, that guy's right." but when I read that in the book, I thought to myself, that's really interesting that people made a joke out of something like that, considering I went to one of those schools and lived in one of those areas in Richmond, California. And I think, again, we're very dismissive of these kind of school to prison pipelines because we see things like independent study. Just that name, like if you called it what it really was, I don't know if parents would be so willing to have their kids in it, because it really is setting you up. Like, here's a packet of shit, put your name on it, turn it in this day, and we might give you some Craigslist job listings around graduation time, right? That's kind of I've been encountering more kids in that system, and it does make me a little uncomfortable whenever I encounter kids in that system, because my first question is like, well, why? And it's like, well, I don't like school. It's like, there's a lot of things, there's tons of shit I don't like. I don't like work, and I allegedly do what I love, and it's stressful, and sometimes I don't like it. Sometimes I don't like the people that I work with. Sometimes I don't like the fucking people that watch the show. There's a lot of shit I don't like. It's not fucking perfect. Nothing's perfect. Now I sound like an old man. I don't give a shit. I am an old man. Deal with it. Fucking deal with it. But seriously, the acceptance of this, and it's like, look, you're going to somewhere where you are going to be surveilled and you are
Hmm.
being tracked in a negative way.
Hmm.
And whatever you and your parents have been led to think that this is, it is not that. How do you talk to people in that situation, or can you talk to people in that situation?
I mean, that so the way in which Nolan and I approached this book was we really wanted a couple things to happen. We really wanted to keep a human element into this. We wanted to make sure that folks knew that we weren't trying to punish anybody for their technology use. And we aren't anti-technologists. We just think everybody deserves to know what is happening with their technology. We also tried our best. This is really tricky given how much these technologies change, but
Yeah.
tried our best to avoid sort of, for lack of a better term, like trendy. We really wanted to kind of talk about some like bigger picture. We do absolutely throw out a lot of brands and a lot of um, corporations, mostly critical of them,
Mhm.
but also trying to say, like, it isn't just about these specific things, it's this bigger picture, right? And so yeah, for quite some time I would say neither of us were terribly fun at parties, because when everybody does the polite thing at a party and it's like, oh, what are you doing, and you're
Yeah.
like, you don't really want to ask that, and then we would tell people,
Mhm.
he's in California, I'm in Massachusetts, we're doing this like across the nation, and people would get really sad, and we got sad too. Like, we're both pretty quick draft writers. We spend a lot of time revising and editing, but we're pretty quick about getting stuff out of our heads.
I'm
And
jealous.
we both kind of confessed at one point that we were really struggling with that. And we sort of realized collectively that part of what we were struggling with was just how hard it was to realize and to put to paper how pervasive all of this is. As a culture, we are trained in sort of soft surveillance, right? The surveillance of convenience. I am
Mm.
never surprised when there's a camera at the ATM, right? I used to live in New York City, and you were never surprised at buildings that had, especially post 9/11, that had
Mhm.
cameras. There was always the Law and Order episode where they would go into the
Yeah.
bodega and they were going to be able to solve the crime, but
Mhm.
the camera was broken, right? And then they actually had to like do something else, right? When we go for the convenience of um, say a restaurant and we look up the menu on a QR code, or anything that we can get on a QR code, there's so many ways that soft surveillance has entered into our lives. Our GPS to help us get places in our car, the Find My app so that I know where my friends are, or I can ostensibly figure out that somebody is safely home.
Wait,
Uh,
so there's a timeout. There's an app where you can find your friends? Is
it,
isn't that called the phone?
No, Find My. Oh my gosh, no, Find My is it again, it got presented to us as like, if you lose your phone, as long as your Find My is on, you can
Oh,
find
okay.
it.
Mhm.
But my students use it to make sure they know, and they use it for two very different reasons. One of them I find annoying, one of them I find pretty sad. The
Mhm.
annoying one is like, if their friends don't text them back right away
Yeah.
and they see on their Find My that their friends are in my class where I ban electronics,
Uh-huh.
they know why they're not going to text them back for 75 minutes. So they can kind of track each other through campus, make sure, the other main reason why they use it, which is just such a mark on the society that we live in, is when they're going out and to make sure somebody got home safely and to sort of
Oh,
track them,
okay.
to make sure that if a friend left with somebody else or if a friend left to walk home alone, they can kind of track them, which
That's
is
cool.
just, it is, but it's also sad that that's the world that we live in.
Is that also part of that built-in fear, though?
I think it's very much part of the built in fear. We've learned how to be afraid, right? My students were not alive during 9/11, but they have grown up with the ripple effects of 9/11, which is a lot more surveillance, right? My students have grown up with their cell phones, their smartphones. They never didn't have a smartphone unless their parents were like really old fashioned. So they've grown up with that access at their fingertips. They've been surveilled since day one. It takes a lot of work to try and kind of introduce some of this stuff to folks as this is the world that you live in. And when we talk with students, when Nolan and I are talking to our classes, we're really not saying to them, and by the way, the most success you're going to get out of this class is to then turn everything off. Like, that's not our motivation at all.
Mhm.
What we really want, as I said before, is for anybody, our students, our teachers, our families, our administrators, to know exactly what is happening with their technologies, why their social media feeds are filled with a specific topic that they kind of can't seem to get away from. Why it's so easy to move through things, why they don't really have to look very hard for stuff that they like because of all the data that they are sharing that says sort of who they are.